My name is Michael Sullivan, and I'm 33 years old. A year ago, I had no idea I'd end up in an unfamiliar town in the northwestern part of the country, far from everyone I knew and from my native Boston. But that's exactly how it turned out, because of the bankruptcy of the company I worked for, my divorce, and a whole string of problems. I no longer had the resources or the desire to stay in a place where everything reminded me of my past failures, so when I came across a tempting advertisement, rooms/apartment for rent in a Victorian house in Ashland, Oregon, for a ridiculously low price, I just thought, why not? When I first saw that house, I felt a little uneasy. A huge, two-story Victorian structure with steep gables and a wooden arcade stood behind a pine grove, showing the marks of time on its facade, chipped paint and rusty gutters. On the metal mailbox near the entrance, the faded inscription, Prescott Residence, was barely visible. Despite an air of neglect, the house had a special charm, a strange blend of antiquity and appealing gloom. Maybe deep down, I was looking for a different kind of life to help me escape my memories, and this house seemed like the perfect portal to a new chapter in my existence. Mr. Prescott, a short, gray-haired man in his 60s, met me on the porch. Shaking my hand, he emphasized that the rental offer would only be valid if I wasn't too picky, and if I followed his rules. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to those words, because I was thrilled about the low rent and the fact that he didn't require a deposit. It all seemed too good to be true, but I figured it could be explained by the fact that people are often afraid to live in such old houses. I ended up with an apartment on the second floor, 3 rooms, a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen, plus a separate bathroom. From the very start, my attention was drawn to a large arched window in the living room, adorned with an antique frame that should have let in plenty of light. But there was something peculiar about it. It was firmly covered with a huge, dark burgundy curtain that barely let any light through. I had hardly stepped inside when Mr. Prescott immediately said, "It's best if you don't remove this curtain or touch the window. It's old and fragile. That's one of the conditions of living here." At the time, I took it as a simple precaution. As soon as I unpacked my things, I noticed the air in the living room was cool and slightly stale, as though it hadn't been aired out in 100 years. When I touched the curtain, it felt damp and cold, as if it were wet. But I told myself it was probably just drafts and condensation getting trapped behind the fabric. I won't damage the owner's property, I decided. After all, the main thing is that the rent's cheap. That first day, I barely slept, between unpacking my suitcases and not being used to the constant sound of rain tapping against the roof and the trees around me. Oregon greeted me with drizzle and autumn fog. Around midnight, just as I was about to go to bed, I heard a faint clicking sound in the living room, something like a light tapping on glass. I stepped out of the kitchen, but everything seemed still. The curtain hung there like an impenetrable veil, and aside from that covered window, the others were tightly shut. I'm probably just imagining things, I thought. But as soon as I lay down in bed, a creak echoed through the corridor. I tried to chalk it up to old floorboards reacting to temperature changes. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up because I thought I heard a faint tap-tap coming from the living room, as if someone was scratching the glass. My whole body filled with a cold dread. I got up, switched on the flashlight on my phone, and hesitating, headed into the room. The nighttime silence made every step sound thunderous. Peeking into the living room, I clearly saw the bottom of the curtain move slightly, almost as though someone were lifting its edge from inside. In that moment, I even thought it might be a hand stretching outward. I froze in place, not daring either to move the fabric or to run away. After a few seconds, the curtain stopped moving and the sound went silent, leaving me with my heart pounding. I barely managed to fall asleep near dawn. With the sunrise, everything seemed less terrifying, but the feeling that something strange was happening in the house never left me. The next day, I headed to the local store, Martin's Grocery, to buy some food and learn at least something about this area. The clerk, named Amanda, turned out to be friendly, but when I mentioned the Prescott house, she grew noticeably cautious. She said people often don't stay in that house for long, and there are rumors of ghosts or strange noises. It's just an old house, she summed up with a shrug. But they say a lot of folks there don't sleep at night. I tried several times to speak with Mr. Prescott to ask him what was going on with the window and the curtain. Every time, he answered dismissively. It's antique glass, dangerous to move. Best not to touch it. And when I hinted that I'd heard tapping at night, he smiled oddly and said, If you don't like something, you can always move out. The barely perceptible hint of mockery in his voice both scared and irritated me. I managed to get more information from Mrs. Hutchinson, the elderly neighbor on the first floor. She admitted that previous tenants had also complained of nighttime noises and the curtain moving. And one man even claimed that something behind the drape was watching him with eyes. In the end, people fled, sometimes leaving some of their belongings behind. Interestingly, Prescott never pressed any claims against them and quickly found new tenants, who, in turn, also didn't stay long. On my way back, I thought I noticed a figure in the bushes near the fence, a thin silhouette peeking out like a spy. When I tried to get closer, it vanished abruptly. Whether it was my imagination or someone actually watching me, I couldn't be sure. But it made me even more uneasy. What if there's not only something supernatural in that house, but also a maniac? At the local cafe, Hazel and Oak, I met Chris, a red-headed young barista. He seemed witty and outgoing, and when he heard where I'd settled, he said, I've heard some scary stuff goes on over there. If you ever need to talk, stop by. Some folks swear the house is cursed, others say the owner's hiding something. I decided not to dismiss his friendly offer, and before long, Chris even came over to my place after I told him about the late night. Tap tap. He came up with an idea. Listen, set up a camera or at least record something on your phone. If that curtain's moving by itself, we gotta catch it on tape. The suggestion both scared and intrigued me, because I felt that if I kept silently enduring this, I might lose my mind from fear. On my second night in the house, I set up my phone with a power bank, placing it opposite the window, and using a small night lamp for enough light so the camera could record something. Chris arrived with a thermos of coffee and some snacks to keep me company. We planned to sit in the dark and wait. Around 10 p.m., the room fell into a heavy silence, and we were starting to doze off in our chairs when we suddenly heard a faint rustle. The heavy curtain moved slightly, and I distinctly heard that familiar tap-tap, as if coming from the inside of the glass. The curtain even lifted from the bottom by a few inches for a moment. A shiver ran down my spine. It really seemed like there was something behind that drape. Chris sat there, pale, staring at it with a bewildered look. The moment we heard a door slam out in the hallway, probably another tenant going out, the curtain's movement stopped. We hoped the camera had captured everything. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this wasn't just our imagination. We both saw it. Reviewing the footage, we were horrified to confirm the curtain really did move on its own, and a faint tap was audible on the recording. The most chilling part, for a split second in the lower corner of the frame, something appeared that looked like a pale hand, which quickly vanished. The camera setup was amateur at best, and the image was blurry, but I could clearly see the outline of 5 fingers. Chris crossed himself, even though he'd said he wasn't religious, and I felt like my life would never be the same again. Now I had proof, and it definitely wasn't just a draft, or peeling paint. We tried to figure out what to do with such a discovery. Call the police? Ridiculous. Summon a group of ghost hunters? And who would even believe us? On the third day, I decided at least to peek behind that accursed curtain. Early in the morning, when there was daylight and the house didn't seem as intimidating, I grabbed a pair of scissors to snip one of the nails holding down the curtain's lower edge. As soon as the blade touched the fabric, a cold gust swept through the living room. It felt like the temperature dropped by a few degrees. I got the sense the house itself was resisting what I was about to do. Despite my nerves, I lifted the lower corner of the curtain a little. I saw the dirty, cracked surface of the glass, like someone had scraped off paint from the inside. There was a dark, grayish spider web hanging in the corner, and pale traces, resembling handprints, on the inside of the window. If those are someone's hands, how did they get there? The thought sent a jolt of horror through me. That same second, I heard a quiet click, like someone on the other side tapped back in response to my action. The curtain suddenly jerked out of my grasp, and I nearly fainted from panic, letting go of it in a hurry. One thought shot through my mind. What if I'm letting this thing out? I decided, in the end, that I had to check out the basement, an area Prescott had forbidden me to enter. The neighbor, Mrs. Hutchinson, mentioned that the door was always locked and that she'd never gone down there herself. I had a strong urge to find out if there were any old documents, or clues that might explain the origin of this ghost. One day, while Prescott was outside, I quietly tested the basement door. It really did have a heavy bolt on it. I saw rust in the keyhole, but I realized it wouldn't be easy to break in. The corridor was oppressively silent, and my heart pounded. If only I had a lockpick, I thought, then recoiled. That would be a crime. I'm not the owner. Before long, Prescott appeared in the corridor and gave me a furious look, silently making it clear I had no business there. I backed off nervously, muttering something about looking for the bathroom. Chris tried to keep me steady. Maybe it's a family tragedy. Maybe someone died in the house once, and their spirit is wandering around. Or maybe Prescott keeps someone in the basement? At first, that sounded like wild speculation, but the more often I heard those nighttime tap-taps, the more I started to believe it myself. We decided to visit the city archive, the local library, to look through old newspapers or official records. We found references to the Prescott family, who had owned the house since the late 19th century. One note from the 1920s mentioned the disappearance of several people who rented rooms there. Apparently, the police never proved anything at the time. There were even a few columns full of rumors about a glass curse, with some folks claiming they had seen the head of the family, Colby Prescott, performing some sort of ritual at the window late at night. There weren't many records, and it all looked like old town gossip, but it was enough for us to realize suspicious events had been happening at that house for decades. On the fourth evening, I felt I could no longer live in fear. If there really was something behind that curtain, maybe it was time to settle things once and for all. Desperation boiled inside me. What if I just break the glass, let in some air, and find out the truth? When night fell, I armed myself with a hammer, found in the storeroom, and stood by the window. My hands were trembling, because I had no idea what I might face. I tried to pry up the bottom edge, and suddenly something on the other side rapped sharply against the glass with such force I heard a faint crack. It was as if whatever was there wanted to break free. I recoiled in fright. Crack! Rang out as I accidentally struck the frame with the metal part of the hammer. A fissure spread across the glass. Through a spot in the wood, where part of the frame had long since rotted away, a bitterly cold draft rushed in, like an icy breath. And then, through the spiderweb of cracks, I clearly saw a pale eye staring right at me from the other side of the window. I nearly dropped the hammer. My back was drenched in sweat, and I couldn't breathe. This can't be. On the other side of that glass should be the street. I panicked. But no glow from the streetlights came through. It was as if there was some other space behind that frame, steeped in shadow and cold. The eye vanished a moment later, and I clamped my hand over my mouth so I wouldn't scream. After that, I called Chris and told him what I'd seen. He arrived late that evening to find me trembling in a corner of the living room. Seeing the broken chunk of glass, he asked, "Why did you do that?" I couldn't give any explanation except, "I just can't keep living in ignorance." That night, we tried to cover the window with a board we found in the storeroom and secure it with screws. But as we worked, the curtain kept shifting back into place as though it had a will of its own, getting in our way. From behind it, we could occasionally hear knocks, as if something in the darkness was trying to break the glass even more. The banging got louder, and I felt the entire house shuddering under the vibrations. We must have made quite a commotion, because we heard Mr. Prescott shouting in the hallway. He burst into the living room and saw the broken glass and tatters of the curtain hanging down. A wild fury lit up his eyes. "What have you done?" I told you not to touch the window. Chris stepped between us, trying to explain. I also attempted to say that something is crawling out. But Prescott raged like a madman. You'll unleash the curse. You don't understand what you've done. He even raised a metal flashlight handle at me, but Chris held him back. At that moment, a powerful blow sounded from behind the window, and the glass cracked even more with a loud crash, showering the room with shards. The curtain flapped wildly, as if caught in a raging wind, and icy moisture poured onto the floor. I felt a thick fog spreading in through the opening. In the dim glow of the table lamp, we saw something like long pale fingers gripping the edge of the wooden frame. Run! Chris shouted, recoiling. I jumped back too, because the sight of that hand was both terrifyingly real and unnatural at once. Its fingers looked far too long, bending twice as much as a human's. Prescott stood there, petrified. It turned out he was just as terrified as we were. His aggression had been an outburst of helplessness. Seconds felt like an eternity. Through the broken window crawled a being resembling a pale silhouette, covered in wet strands of hair or moss, with hollow eye sockets that flickered in and out of view amidst shifting shadows. In the hallway, the lights went out, as though the power surged. It felt like the house was breathing cold and death. Suddenly, Prescott grabbed some old stick standing by the wall and rushed at the creature, shouting, "Go back! Go back!" All we could hear was his hoarse voice, because everything around us seemed to melt into darkness. The creature moved slowly, as though groping its way forward, emitting a faint rustling sound as if dragging wet rags behind it. "You're all to blame," came a rasping hiss that belonged to none of us. I couldn't figure out how it was speaking without a mouth. It seemed the voice was echoing right inside my head. Prescott was stumbling around among the broken glass, shouting, "This is your fault. You triggered everything. I warned you." He was obviously talking about me. He swung the stick, trying to shove the creature back through the opening, but it grabbed his wrist with those long fingers. Prescott cried out, and the air suddenly smelled foul, like something rotten. I realized that if this went on any longer, it would drag him back with it. Shaking, I remembered the hammer lying in the room. By fate or chance, it was nearby. I snatched it up and slammed it down with all my strength on the spot where the creature's hand should have been. A sickening crunch sounded, like bones cracking. The creature hissed, and in the dim light I saw it let go of Prescott and jerk back toward the window. Fueled by adrenaline, I shouted, "Back! Back!" and Chris rushed to help me grab what was left of the board, trying to barricade the broken glass. We hastily nailed pieces of wood to the frame, blocking any passage. The creature clawed desperately, and we heard the boards cracking, but the force of the blow seemed to have stunned it. Prescott, sitting on the floor, groaned, clutching his arm. Gasping, Chris helped him up. At last, the flickering light came back on, probably the power returning. We watched cold fog still creeping out from behind the boarded-up window. Realizing there was nothing left to hide, Prescott slumped against the wall and whispered, You've let it out." Then again, maybe it had been looking for a way out for some time. He confessed that even his grandfather had sealed that opening with the special curtain, performing rituals to tame some entity that had appeared in the house many years ago after a bloody family tragedy. Generation after generation, the Prescotts kept watch over the window, limiting any contact with it. Apparently, however, they never had the strength or knowledge to truly contain the monster. And now that the glass was broken, it had gained the ability to push further and further into our world. I never meant to hurt anyone," Prescott mumbled. "But I couldn't destroy the house. The curse is bound to that window itself." We looked at the shredded curtain, realizing the protection was gone. Staying in that apartment any longer would have been madness. I packed my things in a rush, and Chris helped me carry out my suitcases. Prescott, limping and clutching his injured arm, didn't beg me to stay. He seemed broken and humbled. He didn't even demand any rent. All he could do was try to seal up what we'd destroyed. Would he have enough strength to do it? Chris and I could see some dark shapes still moving in the gaps of those boards, grasping at the air. Maybe it would retreat into the depths of its shadowy space, separated from us by that pane of glass. Or maybe it would find a new crack to slip through. I didn't want to find out. At 5 in the morning, we left Ashland in my old SUV. I remember Chris saying, "You know, Michael, that's the scariest thing I've ever seen. But at least we got out." I agreed, though I felt a pang of guilt. Had my actions doomed other people who might one day end up in that house? Remembering the creature's stare from behind the glass, I felt as though it had marked me. They say that the following week, Mr. Prescott hastily boarded up not just the window but part of the second floor, forbidding any further rentals. I don't know if that will keep the entity at bay forever. Sometimes, in nightmares, I still see that pale hand and hear tapping on the glass. Perhaps it'll stay with me forever, a reminder that some doors are best left shut. I wrote all of this down to unburden myself from silence. I'm not sure if anyone else who's considering moving into a Victorian house with curtained windows and a strange landlord will ever read it. But if you do, remember my words. Whatever's tapping from inside that window, it's best not to answer. I hope no one becomes the next victim of this cursed glass. Because though the house itself may stand firm, it holds dark secrets that go back more than a century. And when you hear that faint tap-tap at night, it might not just be the creak of old floorboards. It could be someone's stolen life, someone's sins, begging to be let out. I still get chills recalling the moment we saw that eye from the other side of the broken glass. It looked both alive and not alive. And I guess I'll never really know who or what it was. But one thing's for sure, some mysteries are better left unsolved.